You walk onto the acute care floor, you grab your coffee, and, you look up at the assignment board. And almost immediately your stomach just drops.
Oh, absolutely. You realize you have an unsafe number of high-acuity patients assigned to you for the next 12 hours.
Right. You tap into that visceral, terrifying feeling of being completely overwhelmed. You just know with absolute certainty that you cannot safely be in 6 rooms at once.
Yeah, it is the universal nightmare of the bedside nurse. I mean, you are instantly calculating the math of the shift. You look at the drips, the turns, the meds, and realize the math simply does not work.
Welcome to the debate. This conversation is a special presentation designed for the Super Nurse platform, which was created by Brooke Wallace.
Right, and Brooke is a 20-year ICU nurse, an organ transplant coordinator, a clinical instructor, and a published author.
And just to be clear, we are not Brooke, but this discussion is built directly from her bedside knowledge, her clinical notes, and her highly experienced ICU teaching style.
Exactly. The goal here is to help nursing students and new nurses connect these massive structural concepts to real patient care at the bedside.
And we also want to invite you to subscribe and watch the video on YouTube. The link is in the description on our channel called Super Nurse AI.
So let's get into it.
Today, we are analyzing a structural issue that dictates your reality at the bedside from the exact moment you clock in. Should mandatory nurse-to-patient ratios be set by law, a union contract, or left to individual hospitals?
Right, like does unionization actually solve the nursing shortage and improve patient safety? Or does it introduce rigidities and the devastating reality of strikes that actually harm patients?
I will argue that widespread unionization and legally mandated ratios are structural necessities to cure burnout, stabilize retention, and ensure safe patient outcomes.
And I will argue that the rigidities of union contracts, the unintended consequences on support staffing, and the severe clinical dangers of nursing strikes prove that collective bargaining is an imperfect and sometimes actively harmful tool for patient care.
So when you look at the landscape of modern healthcare, individual bedside nurses are, largely powerless against consolidated, multi-billion-dollar healthcare corporations. Without collective power, you are navigating an entirely asymmetrical relationship.
Powerless is a strong word, but I see what you mean.
You really have to look at the empirical evidence from California's Assembly Bill 394. That was the 1999 law implemented in 2004 that set minimum nurse-to-patient ratios across the state.
Right, the famous California ratios.
Exactly, and clinical experience shows this law dramatically reduced burnout by capping the sheer volume of patients. More importantly, it actually brought thousands of licensed but inactive nurses back to the bedside.
Because they felt safe again.
Yes. They didn't hate nursing, They just hated the dangerous conditions. Safe staffing isn't just about nurse comfort. It is a critical, life-saving patient safety intervention that requires a legally binding structure.
I come at it from a different way, though. I fully acknowledge the incredible appeal of mandated ratios. I mean, there isn't a nurse alive who doesn't want a manageable assignment.
Very true.
But the realities of collective bargaining often compromise bedside care in, highly unexpected ways. What we know from practice is that when hospital administrators face the soaring labor costs of rigid union contracts, they don't just absorb the loss out of the goodness of their hearts.
No, they definitely don't.
Right. They adapt the ecosystem, and they usually do it by cutting support staff. They reduce the number of CNAs, patient care techs, and transporters.
Which is incredibly frustrating.
It's dangerous. Furthermore, we have to address the ultimate ethical and clinical failure of union leverage, which is the strike. When nurses walk out, patient mortality spikes. Treating healthcare like a traditional industrial labor market where you can simply halt the assembly line is incredibly dangerous for the patients we are sworn to protect.
But let's look at what actually happens when a union-backed ratio is implemented on a busy medical surgical floor. The mechanism here is cognitive bandwidth.
Okay, bandwidth. Go on.
Research shows staggering data comparing California to non-ratio states. If New Jersey and Pennsylvania had matched California's medical surgical ratios, they would have seen 13.9% and 10.6% fewer patient deaths, respectively.
Wow, those are significant numbers, yes.
They are massive. And for a newer nurse listening to this, let's connect this to the bedside reality of pattern recognition.
When you only have 4 patients instead of 6, your brain actually has the bandwidth to process subtle clinical clues.
Right, because you aren't just sprinting between rooms.
Exactly. You can spot a slight, say, 50 cc drop in urine output over 2 hours. You notice a minor, transient shift in a patient's neurostatus. You actually have the time to realize that the heart rate creeping from 90 to 110 isn't just pain.
Right, it's the early sepsis cascade.
Yes, you catch the clinical deterioration before it turns into a full-blown code blue.
The bandwidth argument is completely valid. The evidence tells us that unionized hospitals perform better on 12 of 13 nurse-sensitive metrics. But we have to look at the edge cases and the full clinical picture.
You mean the support staff issue?
Specifically what researchers call the complication paradox. In those same compiled analyses, unionized environments actually have higher rates of pressure ulcers and failure to rescue events.
Which on the surface seems entirely counterintuitive if they have fewer patients.
Right. It sounds crazy, but think about the mechanism of hospital budgeting. Unions drive up RN labor costs significantly through mandatory step raises and strict grids. So to balance a finite budget, hospitals substitute lower-wage support staff.
So they pull the techs.
Exactly. Now you are a highly paid RN with a legally safe ratio of 4 patients. But one of those is a 300-pound, sedated, mechanically ventilated patient who requires Q2 turns to prevent skin breakdown.
Right.
Without enough techs or a lift team to help you safely turn that patient, you are physically unable to do it alone. Pressure ulcers happen.
I hear that, but I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you're essentially blaming a seatbelt for a car crash.
Wait, a seatbelt doesn't cost a hospital 30% of its operating budget.
But the mechanism of harm isn't the nurse asking for a safe assignment. The mechanism of harm is the hospital's budgeting priorities. If a corporate hospital decides to protect its profit margins by firing CNAs, rather than reducing administrative bloat or executive bonuses, well, that is a failure of hospital leadership.
It's a failure of the system, sure.
It is not a failure of collective bargaining. The RN is simply asking for the structural capacity to safely monitor their patients.
But the reality of the ecosystem is that budgets are finite, and C-suites will always protect the bottom line. When you force a rigid, highly expensive contract onto a facility, you cannot be surprised when the ecosystem adapts in ways that harm the patient.
Harm the patient how, though?
Think about failure to rescue. It means a patient developed a treatable complication like internal bleeding, and the team failed to catch it in time. If the RN is stuck doing the primary care tasks, like emptying trash, fetching ice chips, or running their own labs down to the basement.
Because there are no support staff left.
Right, because there's no staff. They are physically out of the room. They are still going to miss the subtle widening of a pulse pressure because they are busy acting as the tech, the transporter, and the housekeeper all at once.
I understand the budget squeeze, I really do. But if the floor is supposedly so stripped of support staff that nurses are acting as housekeepers, we have to ask why union nurses are actually staying at the bedside longer.
What do you mean?
If it's so miserable, they should be leaving in droves. But the retention data paints a very different picture.
But that brings us to the satisfaction-retention paradox. We see this clearly in the 2018 National Sample Survey of Registered Nurses.
Right, the NSSRN data.
Yeah. Unionized nurses consistently report lower job satisfaction than non-union nurses, yet they have significantly lower turnover rates. It's about 10.9% compared to over 13% for non-union nurses.
Which is a good thing for staffing, right?
Well, I argue that unions create a culture of grievance. When you work in a union facility, advancement, shift bidding, and vacation time are almost entirely based on strict seniority.
Which provides objective fairness rather than favoritism.
No, it provides rigidity. That means a stellar, highly motivated nurse with 2 years of experience who just got their CCRN and is constantly hunting for ways to improve unit protocols gets passed over for a day shift preference.
Or a charge roll.
Just because of their higher date.
But they never leave because of the pension and the seniority trap.
The golden handcuffs.
The golden handcuffs are too tight.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. From a bedside logic perspective, that lower turnover is an absolute lifeline for our healthcare system. Replacing one single bedside nurse costs a hospital anywhere from $61,000 to $88,000.
It is incredibly expensive to train new grads.
Right. So retaining these nurses saves millions, which could be used to hire those missing techs you mentioned earlier. And regarding that so-called dissatisfaction, I don't view it as a culture of whining. I view it as psychological safety and empowerment.
Empowerment to complain?
Empowerment to report unsafe conditions without retaliation. Newer nurses might find this confusing, but union nurses report lower satisfaction because they are finally educated on what safe conditions actually should look like.
So they just notice the bad more?
Yes, they aren't accepting the dangerous bare minimum anymore. They have the legal protection through mechanisms like assignment despite objection or ADO forms to vocalize their concerns. They can document that a staffing grid is unsafe without the paralyzing fear of being dragged into the manager's office and fired for being insubordinate.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the clinical impact of keeping deeply dissatisfied, burned-out nurses at the bedside simply because they have a pension?
What do you mean by clinical impact?
Well, is that actually good for patient care? We just talked about pattern recognition. Does an experienced but completely disengaged and disgruntled nurse miss things that a fresh, motivated, non-union nurse would eagerly catch?
I don't know if that's a fair comparison.
If the environment is toxic, but nobody leaves because they don't want to lose their seniority status, the patient is the one who ultimately suffers from that apathy.
I think it's a bit reductive to equate union protection with apathy, though. Clinical experience shows that an experienced ICU nurse, even a frustrated one, possesses a deeply ingrained clinical judgment that a new graduate simply hasn't developed yet.
Experience matters, obviously.
It saves life. That veteran nurse knows exactly what a patient looks like 10 minutes before they lose their airway. They can literally smell a GI bleed from the hallway. Keeping that experience at the bedside rather than losing them to an insurance desk job is exactly what prevents failure to rescue.
I agree. That experience is invaluable. But the rigidity of how that experience is managed is the issue. It crushes morale for the next generation of nurses who realize their effort doesn't matter as much as their tenure.
But what happens when the ADO forms pile up, the unit remains unsafe, and management just flat out refuses to hire more staff? When dissatisfaction boils over and negotiations completely fail, we arrive at the most controversial tool a union has.
Yes, the strike. The ultimate dilemma. Should healthcare workers who hold fragile human lives in their hands have an unconditional right to strike, or should they be treated as essential personnel?
It is the heaviest question in nursing ethics.
And the data on this is heavy, undeniable, and frankly chilling. We have to look at the landmark National Bureau of Economic Research study, which analyzed New York State hospitals over a 20-year period.
Right, I know this study.
The research shows that patients admitted during a nursing strike face an 18.3 to 19.4% increase in in-hospital mortality. They also face a 5.7 to 6.5% increase in 30-day readmissions.
Those are daunting numbers.
They are devastating. And we need to explain why this happens using the clinical concept of institutional capital.
Which means localized knowledge, right?
Exactly. A hospital will hire replacement travel nurses during a strike, and those travelers might be incredibly smart, highly skilled clinicians, but they do not have the localized knowledge of that specific facility.
They don't know where things are.
Right. They don't know the quirks of the hospital's specific Epic build. They don't know that the crash cart on the surgical floor is kept in some odd alcove near the ice machine. They don't know that Dr. Smith wants a text at 2 a.m. for a potassium of 3.2, whereas Dr. Jones will scream at you if you don't page him through the answering service.
Which slows down care tremendously.
It paralyzes it. When a strike severs this institutional capital, critical delays happen. Finding the code cart takes 2 extra minutes. Getting the right orders for a crashing patient gets bottlenecked because the traveler doesn't know the unit's unwritten communication protocols.
And time is tissue.
Exactly. In critical care, those delays mean patients die. Treating nursing like a factory job, where workers can just drop their tools and walk out, is a fundamental violation of the oath to do no harm.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective. Because we absolutely cannot ignore the daily, systemic harm that necessitates the strike in the first place.
But the spike in mortality.
I acknowledge the gravity of that mortality data. It is terrifying. But a strike is never the first option. It is an absolute last resort, legally requiring a strict 10-day notice.
10 days isn't enough to clear a hospital, though.
But during those 10 days, the hospital is supposed to pause elective KFGs, transfer out high-acuity NICU babies, and bring in those contingency staff to safely lower the census.
But emergencies don't stop. STEMIs still roll through the ER doors during those 10 days. The harm still occurs to the patients who just can't be transferred.
Yes, but let me offer an analogy that really resonates in the ICU. A strike is like giving a patient a necessary but highly toxic chemotherapy drug.
Okay, chemo.
Chemotherapy causes acute, temporary, sometimes devastating harm to the patient, but we administer it to cure a systemic lethal disease. Chronic understaffing is that lethal disease.
I see where you're going.
It kills patients silently, slowly, every single day of the year through missed assessments and delayed medications. The strike is the acute temporary harm utilized to cure the systemic danger that hospital administrators have allowed to fester.
I understand the chemo analogy, I really do. It frames the union's intent as curative. But as a clinician, chemo doesn't kill the patient in bed next to you.
That's a fair point.
If I know a specific administrative intervention is going to instantly spike mortality by 19% for the patients lying in the beds right now, I have to question the ethics of that intervention. You are sacrificing the patients of today for the theoretical safety of the patients of tomorrow. That is a heavy, heavy moral burden for any nurse to carry.
It is a massive burden, but I have to challenge you on the alternatives. If healthcare workers are deemed essential and stripped of the right to strike, how else do they force a massive, profit-driven hospital system to implement life-saving ratios?
We can advocate through professional organizations or legislation.
But individual negotiation simply does not work against a corporate C-suite. If a single nurse walks into the C-suite and says, "Hey, it is unsafe for me to have 3 ventilated patients on level fed," management will just look at them and say, "If you don't like it, there's the door."
Well, they might say that, yes.
Collective action and the ultimate threat of withholding labor is literally the only language a financial spreadsheet understands. Furthermore, research shows that non-union hospitals often magically improve their working conditions and pay scales simply out of fear that their nurses will unionize if they don't.
The halo effect.
Exactly. The threat of the union raises the tide for everyone, even those who never strike.
I think the alternative relies on legislative advocacy and evolving state boards of nursing to enforce acuity-based staffing models without abandoning the patients in the beds. The problem with treating the hospital like a factory floor is that our products are breathing, frightened human beings.
Absolutely. Nobody denies that.
When negotiations break down, we can't just halt the assembly line and turn off the lights. The patients still need their antibiotics, they still need their neuro checks, they still need us.
Which is exactly why the 10-day notice exists, to try to mitigate that exact fallout. It is never a decision taken lightly by any nurse. But as we wrap up this incredibly complex issue, let's summarize the core takeaways for the nurses listening right now.
Sounds good.
We explored how mandated, safe ratios drastically improve a bedside nurse's cognitive bandwidth. It gives them the time to utilize true clinical judgment and catch that dropping urine output rather than just rushing blindly through tasks.
We also looked at the satisfaction-retention paradox, unraveling why union nurses might feel empowered to report unsafe conditions, but also fall victim to the rigidities of seniority-based systems that can stifle highly motivated new nurses.
And finally, we confronted the heavy clinical costs of nursing strikes.
Right, recognizing the dangerous loss of institutional capital when the permanent staff who know the facility intimately have to walk out.
Our goal today wasn't to tell you what to think or hand you an easy answer. We want you to leave this conversation feeling validated in the absolute complexity of this issue.
And hopefully equipped to think critically about it.
We want you to be able to look at the data and say, okay, I know my position on nursing unions and whether or not they are good for nurses.
Exactly. And your practical bedside takeaway today is this. Whether you work in a heavily unionized facility in California or a non-union hospital in the South, your primary job is to protect your nursing license and your patient.
Always.
You have to recognize your own limits. You must understand how your patient workload impacts your critical thinking and your ability to spot a deteriorating patient. Never, ever be afraid to advocate for safety, whatever mechanisms you have at your disposal.
Beautifully said. Before we go, we want to remind all our listeners to watch the video of this conversation on YouTube. Give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and please leave a comment with your thoughts on nursing unions.
We also invite you to visit supernurse.ai for amazing resources to help you bridge the gap between nursing school and the intense reality of the floor. We want to help you become the super nurse you were born to be.
Thank you for joining us.
Take care, everyone.
And remember, the next time you walk onto that acute care floor, smell the sanitizer and look up at that overwhelming assignment board wishing you could be in 6 rooms at once, know that you are not alone in figuring out how to fix it. Keep advocating, keep thinking critically, and we'll see you next time on The Debate.